Hello! Today we'll be finishing our Relicblade minis finally. I will be showing you how to blackline, do the final highlights, paint the final details, as well as do the basing. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is just blacklining. There are two ways you can go about this. Normally the way that I blackline when I'm painting models like this in this comic style is I use Pigma Micron pens. They're very cheap for what they are. You can get a 01 or a 04 or around that size, and it tends to work pretty well for minis this size. Alternatively, if you don't want to go buy a pen, you can also just use a very small or very sharp brush. It's just a matter of using black ink, maybe add a little bit of retarder to it, and thin it a bit so that it flows nicely, and you can use that just as well. When blacklining with a brush, you want to try to make sure you're just using the very tip of the brush. Don't use the body of the brush, as that will give you too thick of lines. You want them nice, thin, and crisp. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be using 01 and 04 size micron pens for the bulk of my blacklining. You can use the brush if you prefer, as I mentioned. All we're doing with blacklining is essentially reinforcing the shadows that we already have, but also adding comic style lines and details such as hash marks, lines, cross hatching, things like that. As far as where to place your lines and hash marks and things of that sort, it's really up to you. There are games and movies, comic books, things like that you can look at, like Borderlands, any comic book just about. More cartoony stuff is what I would lean towards to get ideas for where to place things. What I tend to do is, like I said, reinforce shadows. So anywhere I have a shadow, I'll reinforce it with black, a thin line of black inside the middle of the shadow. Around major shapes and colors, anywhere two different colors intersect, you want to have a pure black line separating them. You can do, I like to do dots next to each other or small lines next to each other. These are really good on like large flat surface areas or more rounded objects, things like that, just to add something there to make it more detailed and nice looking, and it helps sell the comic book style. So once we've done all of our blacklining, I'm going to use, it's called a jelly roll pen. It's basically a gel ink, but it's pure white, and I'm going to use this to add basically like artificial highlights. As far as where to place these, I tend to place it on, if you think of kind of like zenithal highlighting, on the peak of objects, the highest point or the sharpest point, the edges of cloth, the edges of metal, things like that. For the final detailing that needs to be done, at least on my model, I need to paint the bottle on his back as well as his eyes. For the bottle here, I've already base coated it a purple color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a blue and a blue-green color, and I'll be adding those to make it appear as if there's liquid of some sort inside the bottle, like a potion. Generally, when I'm doing relatively quick, small objects like this, the way that I tend to paint them in order to get basic, simple blends is, I think it's commonly referred to as like loaded brush or something, but I just call it feathering because that's what it is. You want to use relatively unthinned or completely unthinned paint in your palette. You want a moist brush, not wet but moist. You put just a tiny bit of paint on the very tip of the brush so that the rest of the brush is just water. You then apply the paint where you want the bulk of the color to be, and then swish back and forth as you drag your brush down. For the eyes, I'm going to be using ice yellow, just pure ice yellow. I thin it down enough that it will flow with just water. And then it's just a matter of wicking the paint off onto a fingernail, onto a paper towel, the palette itself, whatever works. Then it's just a matter of very carefully painting the white of his eyes. I usually orient the brush in the same direction of the essentially shape of the eye so that I don't hit anything else with the brush as I'm applying it. For the pupils, I'm going to use a pigment micron pen again. I think this is the 04. It's just a matter of carefully dotting it in there until you have a more or less round dot in the appropriate place you want the eyes to be looking, essentially. I'm placing the dots on roughly the center of my eyes. After I've painted these details, I then go back in with the Jelly Roll pen as well as the micron pens. I add some extra hash marks where applicable if I feel like they're missing somewhere, as well as reinforce highlights further on both the painted detail I just did, the bottle, as well as on the back of the model that I may have missed earlier. So then the last step of our project is going to be painting a base. So normally I like to sculpt bases and then paint the base a three-dimensional base, but there's a YouTuber, I think he's named Epic Duck Studios, and he sometimes paints his bases two-dimensionally, and I think that's an interesting idea. Jatby herself showed me this technique on her Relicblade models, so I figured I'd try that today. So for painting the two-dimensional base, I just have a acrylic disc. This is what I use on most of my minis, is acrylic discs. The first thing is to scuff up the top of the disc to make sure that it has a surface that will hold paint. After that, I'm just going to base coat it with a black-brown primer. This is obviously for priming purposes. We're just going to do 2 layers. I just brush it on heavily in one direction, let that dry, or in this case I'm going to dry it with a hairdryer, and then once that's dry I go the other direction with another layer of primer. This helps kind of break up the brush strokes and hide them a little bit. Afterwards we're going to pick out 3 colors, give or take. I'm going to use 1 for the stone, and then I'm going to mix the others to make interesting looking highlights. So in this case I'm using a blue-green, I'm going to be using ice yellow, and a bluish gray color. And I'm going to mix those on my palette here. For these colors I want them to be relatively thin, so I add maybe about half water just to make sure it's nice and thin and flowy, but not too thin that it's transparent, because it's easier if you don't have to do multiple layers to build up a decent coat. So once I have my colors mixed up, I'm going to take my brush, I'm just using a number 1 or a number 2 here, I don't remember exactly, and then I'm going to paint very quickly, very simple, round, oblong, oval type shapes, just to make them look like, basic cobblestones and like a cartoony kind of look. Once I have the shape of my cobblestones down, I'm then going to add one of the green colors that I mixed up with a little bit of the gray and a little bit of ice yellow. I'm just adding this kind of in a crescent sort of shape on most of the cobbles. There's not really any logic to this necessarily. It's really just to add variety and detail and make them look like cobblestones as close as I can get, essentially, without putting too much effort and detail into it. And then once I've applied that to most or all of the stones, I then go in with a brighter color. This is essentially the same color, but I've added a lot more ice yellow to it just to bring it up brighter. This is serving as a basic highlight, and I'm going to apply this inside of the previous layer I did with the green, and try not to overlap too much or go outside of the lines, but I also don't want to cover up the previous color. This is essentially, again, looking to simulate like algae, moss, stuff like that, but also this is serving as a highlight color. Now that I've got that layer applied, that's the final layer of paint I'm going to be doing. So now I'm just going to go back in again with the micron pens. Again, you can use a brush and black ink if you'd rather, but I prefer the micron pens. And then I'm just going to add, again, little dots, hash marks, jagged lines, things like that. I tend to focus these around the edges of the stones, but it's good to sometimes put them more in the central areas just to break things up and add variety. And then the final step as far as painting is concerned is again with the jelly roller, just like before with the mini. I'm going to then apply final peak white highlights with the jelly roller. I focus these exclusively around the edges of the objects, around the edges of the cobbles essentially. because you want it to kind of simulate the idea of like the cobble has like a hard edge where, you know, it's been carved away to make a cobblestone or whatever, stuff like that. And that's the final step as far as painting goes. So now the last thing we have to do is put our mini on the base and then varnish. So putting the mini on the base is the scary part. It's smart if you do this step earlier on in the process, but, you know, I don't tend to do that because my brain doesn't work that way. If you want to do that, more power to you, but I don't. So with metal minis like this, they usually come with a small bar on the feet. What I like to do, instead of cutting the bar off entirely and then pinning the feet, because that can go wrong, it can be difficult, it chews up drill bits, it's annoying. I hate it. So what I do instead is I cut the bar off, leaving only a small square underneath each foot. The reason for this is I can then drill holes in the base that match these pegs, and then just, you know, glue the pegs in, and there you go. You already have a pinned mini. It's stronger than a pin because it's literally cast into the model's feet. When clipping the bar off, if you choose to do it this way, just be careful that you don't damage the paint job. That can be difficult, but you can wrap the mini in plastic wrap, like kitchen plastic wrap, and that will protect the paint job. Or just be very gingerly with it, and, you know, don't rub it too much with your fingers, as that can remove the paint. Once I have the pegs created on the bottom of the feet of my mini, by cutting the bar off, I then get a matching drill bit. This is just a drill bit set from, I think the company is Wave. I'm using a rotary tool here, however it's probably a lot safer and easier to use a just simple pin vise. The first thing is to use the mini as a guide for where the holes need to be. I just place the pegs of the feet on the base and scratch the base up a little bit in that one spot. That way I have the exact location I need to place my drill bit to create matching holes. Then drill out the holes. It's pretty easy, pretty simple. Just try not to skate on the surface, as you might scratch your paint if you do that. Of course, you can also do this before you paint the base, but again, I don't work that way. So now that the holes are there, we can just glue the mini in. You may have to use an X-Acto knife or something and carefully carve or sand. You can use a file the pegs that we cut down so that they fit better in the holes. And once you've got that, just add some super glue to the bottom of the pegs, or to the sides of the pegs, and then squish your mini in there. It is okay if there's a slight gap between the bottom of the feet and the base. We're going to, as a final step, paint black around the feet to make it blend in a bit better with the base, so that it doesn't stand out and you don't see any like shiny metal or anything like that. Because I want to get this process done now, because it's 2 in the morning while I'm recording this, I'm going to spray accelerator on the super glue so that it dries instantly. The important thing here is you don't want the accelerator to just sit there on the model, because it does contain chemicals like acetone sometimes, and that can ruin your paint job. So I'm using a hairdryer to quickly dry it, that way it doesn't affect anything. The last thing before varnishing, I'm going to paint the base rim. I always do black or black brown. You can do colors if you prefer. I know Japby likes to do purple or blue, or a color that matches the mini to kind of tie the base together. That's a great idea. Otherwise, just paint it black and paint a small black line to clean up the bottom of the feet to make sure that it blends in nicely. And that's our mini done. So to finish it off, I'm just going to matte varnish the whole model. As you may have seen throughout this process, the wash that I used is very glossy. The pen also has a very glossy ink. So matting the whole model down will bring everything together, hide some slight mistakes, and make it look nice and matte and soft. I like to use Vantage Model Solutions matte varnish. It's a very simple to use varnish. You airbrush it. You don't have to thin it at all, even though it's very thick. You just put it in your airbrush and you spray it on. I tend to spray it on very heavily so that it creates a nice layer. and it also gets like kind of a slight satin sheen rather than just being pure matte. And with that, we finished our mini. If you guys have any questions at all, you can feel free to PM me or tag me if you're a subscriber in the subscriber channels, so the Paintalong channel for this mini. And yeah, that's how I paint comic style. So thank you guys for watching. I appreciate your patience in waiting for this last part to come out. I know it took a very long time. If any of you out there are watching and are not a subscriber and you're interested in subscribing either to my YouTube channel or to my premium subscriptions, I do coaching, critique, as well as paint-alongs like this one where everyone gets to participate, follow along to these videos, and then I critique and help along through the process so that you get direct feedback on learning a new technique and a new approach. I have links in the description to my Patreon page as well as the Discord server that I moderate, and I'll see you in the next one.